Secrets.
And greetings everyone, I'm Henny Fufir, I work as Director at Open Secrets, and just a special welcome to everyone who's joining us online, but also to everyone from the Kalela campaign who's with us here today. We just want to acknowledge you and everything you do.
Welcome, and to introduce myself quickly, my name is Simon Allison. I am the Editor-in-Chief of The Continent newspaper, which is a Pan-African paper. Now, when Open Secrets first approached The Continent to discuss this story, I thought, wow, this is a very old story. It deals with events from sort of 1990, the late 1980s and the early 1990s. This, we may think, is old history, except, as we all know in this country in particular, there are still many wounds from that time that have not yet healed over. And there are many injustices that have not yet been corrected. This report seeks to correct one of these injustices, although I think it achieves several along the way. And it connects two crimes against humanity. One, the apartheid regime in South Africa, and number two, the genocide in Rwanda. And it does so through an extraordinarily forensic and detailed investigation into how the Rwandan genocide received its weapons, and in particular, the role of South Africa in facilitating those weapon transfers. Those are the big details. The smaller details read like a Hollywood thriller. The journalist Naren Tulsi, who is helping The Continent reporting the story, described the story as a Graham Greene novel waiting to be written. And I couldn't agree more. And to sort of bring out that element of the story, I want to start by painting a few scenes. And the first scene is in 1989, and it is in the Tynhuys office in Cape Town of the then President P.W. Botha. And he's having a meeting with a certain Nelson Mandela. And at the time, no one knows that this meeting is happening. But it is one of the most significant signs yet that the end of the apartheid regime is on the way. There is one photograph of that meeting. And let's talk a little bit about the photographer that day. Mamelo, do you want to describe the photo, who took it, and why we're interested?
So you will see in the photo, the only photo that exists of that meeting, is Nelson Mandela, Neil Barnard, and P.W. Botha. And behind the camera, the man holding the camera, is the secretary to P.W. Botha, Willem Das Ellis. And Das Ellis is a man of many lives, and at that point he is essentially running the office of the presidency. But later on, we see him evolve as this man of arms dealing across the African continent and the world for regimes willing to do clandestine deals, as the Biden government had been doing for many years. And he is kind of this central node of, in this particular story, of an illicit arms transaction. But he's part of a machinery in the apartheid regime, and also that kind of survives from the apartheid regime to become this new network and across the African continent. Yeah.
A very high up figure in the regime. He's part of PW's inner circle, but that regime is crumbling and he's trying to figure out what to do next. Right? The next scene I want to paint for you is in the Mediterranean Sea. And there is a ship setting sail. It's called the Malo. It has a Greek flag flying above its mast. And in its cargo decks are an extraordinary amount of ammunition and weaponry. Henny, do you want to talk us through what this ship is doing and why we're interested?
Yeah, so I think it's fascinating. On the one side, we talk in this report about the arms dealers and we talk about the role of the banks, but I think when looking at the story, we recognized how so many violent and brutal conflicts are interlinked. It happens today, and it was certainly something that was happening at that point. And at the end of the Cold War, the world was awash with weapons, and they were weapons that were supposed to be used and that were used against civilian populations in many countries. And this Greek ship, as you've described it, son, and I think that's why we're glad we're here with the continent, because it is a continental story in many ways. This Greek ship is in the Mediterranean. It's leaving Montenegro, so it's an area in Yugoslavia and other countries that have themselves been the site of war in the 1990s, and travels to. It's in fact intended to travel through the Suez Canal to Somalia, and we forget now, but at that time Somalia was the site of war and conflict itself, in a very bloody conflict. And the hulls of this vessel, the ship, were filled with weapons that were meant to continue the killing spree, this time against from what was Europe to Somalia. And we don't know exactly what happened, so we're very clear about this. But what led to a decision to seize those weapons? But in the tiny island of Seychelles, which, if you look at the world map, the map of Africa is, I'm not exactly sure, I'm about 1,000 kilometers more off the coast of Kenya. So, if you had to imagine sort of traveling east, there's the tiny island of Seychelles. Very rich South Africans and rich folks from around the world like to go on holiday in Seychelles with the fancy resorts that are there. But the Seychelles was also a center for sanction busting during the apartheid regime. And what happened was the authorities of Seychelles, the Coast Guard, were ordered to impound the ship, the Malo. And so they took the Malo, this was in 1993, they took the ship basically into custody. We don't know who told them to impound it. We do know that Seychelles didn't have a sophisticated, they didn't have a sophisticated intelligence network that they were tracking these ships, so one would assume it could have been the Kenyans, it could have been, frankly, the Kenyans, the South Africans, at that time, the Americans who didn't want those weapons to go to Somalia, the French. There's any number of big powers that might have been the ones who intervened. And the ship is then impounded. And the problem for Seychelles is that it's had a number of coups during the 1980s. And they certainly didn't want, there was a danger of having a big ship with lots of weapons in your harbor when you know that there has been coups that have been fomented against different governments. And so then, what we come to is the idea of trying to find a potentially willing buyer for those weapons.
So, Mamela, do you want to pick the story from there? So, you've got all these weapons sitting in a port in the Seychelles, and the Seychelles government wouldn't mind making a little bit of money from them, but who's going to buy a cargo of weapons, and how?
Yes, so the Seychelles government at that point, initially it tries to destroy the weapons. And it tries to do this with the assistance of the United States and impose on them, and I think France, to also help them destroy the weapons. And those authorities are unwilling to help. And the Seychelles is now stuck with 80 tons of weapons that were destined for Somalia, cannot go to Somalia, but they want to get rid of them, they cannot hold them. And at the time, the Seychelles was led by President Rene. He was a dictator at the time. And he was a very close friend of the apartheid state and had a lot of ties with members of the apartheid state, one of them being our friend, Willem Darras Ehlers. And a deal was brokered. We don't know whether it was brokered from the Seychelles to South Africa, but what happened is that Darras Ehlers, being friends with President Rene, knows that there are weapons in the Seychelles that the Seychelles would like to get rid of. And when he's approached by Rwandans, one of them being Theoneste Bagasora, who's one of the masterminds of the Rwandan genocide, he comes to him and he says, we need to buy arms, we need to buy them illicitly because we are under an arms embargo in Rwanda as of June 1994, but we need these arms. And in South Africa, in Gauteng, they facilitate this arms transaction where Darras is like, I have arms in the Seychelles, I have a connection, and you need arms. We can get them from the Seychelles to Goma in the DRC, and if you have read our Open Secrets' previous work, apartheid Ganzamani, you will know that Zaire, or the DRC today, was a port at which arms could be moved for the South African government, because the Zairean government would give the South African government end-user certificates. So an end-user certificate is something that arms sales have to have, because it shows that the arms are going to from this person to that person, and you need to be able to verify that those arms do not end up with a third party. But because the apartheid government was not allowed to buy weapons, because it was under arms embargo, it had to do so illicitly. And the government that was willing to do that illicitly with them was the Zairean government. So you have a bunch of moving parts. So Tars and Bagasora leave South Africa, go to the Seychelles, interact with a guy named Colonel Peye. He is in charge of the arms, and they agree to sell the arms to Zaire. But the end destination of the arms is actually Rwanda, in particular a place called Gisenyi, where around 50,000 people were murdered. So the arms make a very circuitous route, because they were on a small plane, a DC-8. I don't know what that kind of looks like, but it's very small. This trip needs to be made 3 times. It is stopped on the 3rd time because the Seychelles media finds out that these arms are actually destined for Rwanda, which the world at the time is kind of knowing that this is a genocide going on, and that all countries have been banned from exporting to Rwanda. Why is the Seychelles involved in this? And who's the South African man who is able to sell these arms, and why are they doing business with known genocidaires?
The timing of this is all quite crucial, because this transaction with the Malo's arms that ended up in Rwanda happened in June 1994. The genocide began in April 1994. It was already very well established on the international agenda that, if not a genocide, but certainly a serious crime against humanity was being perpetrated in Rwanda, and yet this deal went ahead anyway. Obviously, the people involved in doing this probably didn't want details of this deal being made public. How did you find them?
It's very interesting. I think I may actually pass it on to Henny, because a lot of this material actually came out. It's work that we've been doing for nearly 5 years now.
I'll fill it, you go.
Okay, I'll go. And we were Henny at the time. This was before I joined Open Secrets, where we actually acquired documents through Promotion of Access to Information Act requests from DERCO. That's the Department of International Relations and Cooperation, and similar, I think, also Department of Defense as well, sorry. Yes, and in those records, we were able to see this reference to this man, Tars Eerdes, who had in 1994 facilitated this arms transaction and had been involved in the apartheid state as well. We did not know yet what his links to the state was and what would become of him, because beyond 1994, Tars continues to perpetuate a lot of crimes in other places because he's allowed to act with impunity. He's never held to account in 1994. He does other things. So initially, a lot of the work is from those actual archival documents that we get from the DERCO and from the Department of Defense. But then, because we see this reference, we start doing searches, do everything. We go online, we find what journalists have written. We go through the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda's records. I went through the SABC archives, which is where I was able to find a video of Paul Kagame standing in a sea, unfortunately, of dead people. And he's asked, I see you're holding weapons that are from South Africa. And he says, yes, the Rwandan government was a very particular client of the government of South Africa. So we traced not just the arms that were sold by terrorists, but then we also could see the relationship that had existed from the 1980s between the South African government and Rwanda, and a lot of other African governments really. We were also able to trace some declassified records from the CIA. So the CIA has a website where you can actually just find documents and search stuff. I just put in the word Rwanda and I read all the documents, and I found this cable that said these arms were spotted, and a man called Das Ellis, a South African, was known to be courting with Genocide. Different sources. It is, I think if you, if you were to go into the folder that we've created that's just about Rwanda, it is quite amazing how much evidence there is of what went on in this one single arms transaction and its impact, but that there has been absolutely no justice for the victims and no accountability for this man.
Can I just add there, if I can? Mamelo, thanks. I think it's a reminder what you were saying as well, is that there have been very important investigations undertaken by the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. So we've had international jurists look at this and a mountain of evidence. And of course, the reminder that this wasn't the only arms sale or arms deal that aided the genocide. There are many, many other perpetrators out there who arguably have not been held fully to account. But I think from Mamelo, what you were saying as well, what we really learned from the documents, and it was the work of researchers. They were researchers working for Human Rights Watch, they were researchers working in a range of civil society organizations who've been doing hard slogging. So we don't suggest that we've suddenly arrived and claim this, that we always stand on the shoulders of others when we do this kind of work. But importantly, what it also helps us to understand is that we look at Tas Ellis as a man, right? A very powerful man. He takes a photo in P.W. Botha's office, but he's a commodore in the Navy. He's one of the top brass in the 1970s who's working with the apartheid regime at that time, deployed in France. He sails a submarine from France at the time that the French government is very happily supplying weapons to the apartheid regime, because they are amping up, they're increasing their allyship with the apartheid regime. Through the 1970s and the 1980s, the French government with the apartheid regime. The regime even acts sometimes as a proxy for countries like France in the wars that are taking place around the continent. And I think, Mamelo, as you were saying, what happened with that transfer of weapons, the state-owned arms company, Armscor, was very happy to sell weapons to Rwanda up to 1992, from what we understand. By 1994, when this particular shipment that we were focusing on from Lamalo, when there was the attempt to buy weapons, that the reason we bought from them was because we were going through the process of change. And the bosses at Armscor realized that the way they were doing business would need to change. Because you couldn't do the same thing. There were going to be new guys in charge. Nelson Mandela, who's outside here on the square, and the government, the liberation government, was about to take power, was taking power in the sense of, had been voted into power in South Africa in terms of our own process of democratic liberation. And so there had to be a new way of doing things. And that way involved working with bad guys gone private, is a way to describe it. To understand that that's what happens then and happens now, is that very often people who have knowledge from within governments, as Ellis sat there in P.W. Botha's office every day, he welcomed all the heads of state who came in, the generals who came to see P.W. Botha, and he did that for 11 years. So he has an intimate knowledge of the very center of power of the apartheid regime. People like Ellis and others then monetize what they're doing. They go private, and that's a way for them to make cash. And I think we are focusing on Ellis and the system, and we'll talk about maybe the system of banks that enable that. But I just want to end, Simon, by saying is that I think it's a recognition that this way of doing things has not necessarily stopped. We see that here, we see that in the United States, and many other governments, the same kind of thing take place. And that's precisely as Open Secrets why we look at this, because we're saying, we need to look at the enablers. This man, just the guy who's this, his argument is, I was just the secretary. Do you want tea? Do you want coffee? Please come inside. I know you're here, Mr. You can speak French. In fact, the argument is that many of these people have very powerful positions and are intermediaries they continue to play that role as intermediaries for violence and violence against people, and that's what we would argue happened precisely here.
It's been 20, maybe 30 years since this arms deal went through. Suddenly, we know the details about what happened, thanks to the work that Open Secrets has done. Does South Africa have a duty to prosecute this case?
Yeah, I mean, I think having listened to Henny and Mamelo and reading the report, if South Africa didn't have an obligation to prosecute, we would be in a much dire situation as a participant in the global world order. That obligation stems from the fact that we participate as a country within the world. We are part of the UN, we are party to the Rome Statute, and regardless of whether we were party to any of those treaties, we have customary international law, and that is something that applies to every single state, regardless of whether you're a member of the UN, regardless of whether you have been party to the Rome Statute, and what that does is it essentially says that some practices cannot be, some practices are so serious that you have an obligation to act by virtue of humanity. And that includes crimes like genocide, terrorism, crimes against humanity such as apartheid, torture, a whole host of what we call grave crimes. So we have that obligation as an international actor, and then we also have our constitution, of course. And section 232 of the Constitution essentially lays out what customary international law says. So even if we didn't have customary international law, we would have our Constitution as a foundation for which the government is required to prosecute violations of human rights that relate specifically to grave crimes. But there's also another sort of step that needs to take place. We can have obligations to other states and other nations, but we also need to have an obligation that exists locally, right? We call that domestication. So we have legislation that domesticates the Rome Statute, that deals with the International Criminal Court and crimes within its jurisdiction. And then we have the implementation of the Geneva Act as well. So we have all the sort of legislative frameworks that say very clearly we have an obligation where we can to prosecute our own that violate human rights. Our Constitutional Court also confirmed this in a number of cases, including the National Commission of Sex versus the South African Litigation Center. And in that case, it's dealt specifically with torture in Zimbabwe. So we have precedent, we have legislation, and there's no denying the fact that our National Prosecuting Authority must act where it can. And in particular, because Ellis is a South African, we don't need to take ownership of the entire genocide because, as my colleagues have said, we had the tribunal in Rwanda. It dealt with those that it could within its jurisdiction and within its powers. But we should not allow those that can be attributed to us go without any accountability. We cannot be okaying the fact that a South African citizen with a deeply long history of impunity go without being held to account.
Willem Ellis is 90-something?
70. Little younger.
Little younger.
75.
75. And he lives in a very nice house in Waterkloof, in Pretoria somewhere. There has been no legal efforts to hold him accountable for his role in this transaction. There's an extraordinary scene in this report, if you read it, where after sort of laying out all the details of the transaction and Ellis's role, the Open Secrets team actually meets Ellis in person. Can you tell us, Mamelo, about that meeting, how it came about, and what it was like to actually talk to someone implicated in crimes of this magnitude?
So last year in September, we tried to reach out to Ellis in many forms. we emailed, we called. Finally, we learned the good trick that the continent knows so well, WhatsApp. Yes, and Henny, we had his number, we tracked it down, and Henny WhatsApped him the list of questions that we had. And I think what experiences taught us is that it's actually better to not just have someone reply an email or in text. So we were like, here are the questions, but we would really love to meet with you and talk to you, because you need to get a feel of the person, like who is this man? And after some back and forth, we negotiated and were actually able to set up a meeting with him. We'd hoped to actually meet him in Waterkloof in his comfort space, but obviously that would have made him probably more uncomfortable. So he negotiated for us to actually have that meeting at the Intercontinental Hotel at OR Tambo. So we're based in Cape Town, where the secrets is. So we flew in on that morning and went straight to the hotel to meet this man. And I think because we'd come so far with already writing the report, we'd written quite a bit of it by then. I was expecting an arms dealer to walk into the room. I was expecting someone who looked, I don't know, but war criminally. But he was extraordinarily normal. He looked like someone's grandfather or someone's like, he was just such a gentleman, just suave. He was wearing a white shirt, he tucked it in, and he just walked in. He was very polite, you know. He greeted us in both English and Afrikaans, and then he looked at me and he said, I can also speak Zulu, you know. And I was like, I don't speak Zulu. I am Sotho, but okay. He was friendly, and he ordered a tea, he ordered rooibos. And we had this conversation about apartheid, about Nelson Mandela, about arms transactions that he's alleged to have been involved in, about his relationship with the Colombian government and how he negotiated for them to get parts for planes that they needed when Colombia was itself in civil war. And he was just so ordinary. I mean, Hannah Arendt has many problems, but it really, I feel it really brought home the banality of evil, because he was effusive. I can't say if I had met him in a different context, I would hate him. And I think that's the thing with middlemen, is that they can fit into, they're very suave, very smooth. They can fit into so many contexts. Like a guy like Tiones Bagosora, who was a colonel in Rwanda. He was very firm, you know, whenever you see him, even at the ICTR, he's very much like, you know, I did this thing because I believed in this, whatever, whatever, whatever. But Taras is more like, I am a businessman, I have contacts, this is just business. But you really need to hone down on middlemen like that and say, the sale of arms is not just business. Because your business could have resulted in the murder of 50,000 people. You cannot just sit here, be a nice man ordering a rooibos. Like, it was very confusing for me, I will admit. I felt conflicted when I left because I was like, really like him, but I know what he's done. And it's yeah, I think we need to, it really, I think that also it really shows how a lot of perpetrators, we should not so much dehumanize them, because at the end of the day, perpetratorhood as much as victimhood is a very human story. And at the end of the day, we always need to get back to who was this affected the most and get back to the humanity, and really place humanity at the center of how we deal with situations like this. Because it's a deeply human story. It's not business, it's not transactions, it's not weapons. It's about humans. And humans should care for each other better and not do this to each other.
You don't often think of Bond villains drinking rooibos. But now I will. So what happens next? This report comes out, it really is the evidence in here is damning. Lutando, is there going to be any further action?
So we've been sort of developing a docket, specifically around illness, and the fact that he aided and abetted the crime of genocide. And that is a docket that we hope to submit to the NPA quite soon, and essentially see that they continue to investigate and eventually prosecute him. And the reason why that's important is because, you know, as I've already said, we have an obligation to do so. There is absolutely no negotiating why we should be doing that, right? And the NPA needs to act wherever it has capacity and resources to do so in furthering this case matters. And I think there's also, you know, you started off saying this happened almost 30 years ago. So some people might ask why. Like, why, you know, he's an old man, he's in his 70s, he's having a great time in Pretoria with his grandkids, like, leave him alone. But that doesn't mean that the consequences and the effects and the scars and, as you said, there's no healing. And arresting and prosecuting Ellis won't necessarily undo the genocide. But at least we can say that this is not something that we are ever going to say is acceptable, you know, as a nation. And it's also quite embarrassing that we haven't acted at this point. Other countries, I mean, one of the banks that's connected with this in the report, being Paribas, is undergoing a prosecutory process in France. It already went through some prosecutory process in the US in relation to, you know, other shady dealings in Sudan, where they were fined millions of dollars. So other actors on the world stage are doing what they can. They haven't felt the need to say, well, we're going to let this matter leave and lie because so much time has passed. We need to do what we can to see that the people of Rwanda see some form of justice, because that injustice is going to continue, you know, far into the future. So that docket is something that we want to see the NPA take forward, where we can provide evidence, as we have done in the report. We're going to do so. But there are some things that we are limited in doing. At the end of the day, we're an NGO. We don't have access to certain evidence that we know exists in other jurisdictions across the world. And in that case, we also ask the NPA to do what it can. It has the powers, essentially, to request information from the courts in France or the courts in the US in order to compile and put together the case that lays squarely that Ellis's conduct was criminal.
Can I just add there, to what Tando was saying, Pamela being just saying, Simon as well, that I mean, I think when we do this work, we focus very squarely on the issues of reparations and responsibility, and I think that's what we've been talking about. And you know, there are people here in this room and many others, and I think about the work that Kulamani, Kalela campaign and others have led on, is to say that we need reparations for the crime of apartheid, right? It's the money that's owed to people who have been identified as the victims of apartheid by the South African government. But the argument that many of these comrades have made for a long time is that there were many companies that were very central to helping the apartheid regime, whether it was the Mercedes-Benz or the big arms companies or the many banks in Switzerland and the United States and elsewhere that provided lines of credit. And that's a struggle that they have certainly led for many years. I think, Lutanda, as you're saying, you know, we continue our push to hold the banks that financed, not rather financed, but supplied the money laundering network for the apartheid regime in Belgium and Luxembourg to account. We haven't seen that happen from the side of the National Prosecuting Authority. In fact, I think we have a lack of appetite to deal with the whole range of enablers. Tas Ellis sits with over 40 million, if I'm right, 40 million rand in today's rand value is what he made out of this arms deal that may have led to the murder of up to 50,000 people. We don't know how many people might have been murdered. So we use that number. It could have been 1,000, could have been 50,000 people. People lost their lives. And we're saying that that money, he must do reparations on his own. That's his responsibility. But secondly, the state has a responsibility to force that process of reparations. And, you know, Lutano, you were making that point, is that this bank, it was, you know, what's really important that also led us in a way to pick up this work is that this civil society organization in France called Sherpa They, in fact, 5 years ago started a process of trying to hold the big French bank, BNP Paribas, that's been involved in all kinds of shady transactions, historically sanctions busting and other activities that might get us in trouble for saying that, but I think they've done the crimes as well. Together with big banks in the United States, in Switzerland, these banks were all facilitators of the genocide, like others in their own way. They allowed this money to flow through their bank accounts when it was quite obvious what it would be used for and how it was going to be utilized. So what's happening in France is let those civil society organizations in France lead their part of the struggle. They must hold those banks to account. We need to hold others to account. But we do need to see it as a system. When we arrived here today, we look outside at some of the big banks here outside Sandton Square, and that's why we chose to come to a public library in Sandton Square. It's a public space surrounded by banks. Sasfin Bank around the corner, central to the so-called gold mafia that Al Jazeera has unearthed in terms of facilitating the movement of cash. And there's obviously many other operations that play the role. And I think, as Mamela was saying, that it's about recognizing the role of those enablers and finding mechanisms to hold them to account and realizing as civil society we don't have all the means. We'll campaign, we investigate, we'll, as Rutana, as a lawyer, you were saying, we can prepare dockets and we'll do all the technical work. But the people who have to bring it across the finishing line are those people that we pay every month to do their jobs at the NPA and other institutions and the Hawks and others, and we need to see the action from them.
And on that note, I'd like to open the floor for any questions for the Please introduce yourself and your affiliation before asking the question.
Thank you, Simon. My name is Piers Pigu. I'm the head of Southern Africa program at the Institute for Security Studies. Thank you very much for that input. It was fascinating, and congratulations on the sterling work that you do at Open Secrets. I got three sort of questions to ask. The first one, in no particular order of importance. The first is in the context of South African Rwandan relations, which we know have been up and down, continue to be a sensitive one, certainly in terms of continental political positioning around contemporary conflicts, as we see in the DRC today and in northern Mozambique. What's the response of the Rwandan government to this issue? We wonder whether you've been able to approach the Rwandan authorities and ask for their position on this particular issue. I kind of linked that, I suppose, is why did the ICTR, the International Criminal Tribunal on Rwanda, not pursue this particular matter? I mean, we know that they had a limited bandwidth in terms of these issues, but was this particular issue in the role of Ella's profile at all? It sounds as though it was. And going to the last point, which is kind of well, it will lead into a question, but it's a reflection on what Henny's just said about the responsibilities of South African institutions. Given the realities of how badly affected the Hawks and the NPA have been in terms of stripping capacity and competency, how realistic is it for us to, I'm not saying we shouldn't fight for it, but how realistic is it in a context of multiple competing investigative and prosecutorial priorities that a case like this, and you could extend that to some of the TRC related cases, are ever going to get more than a limited amount of attention? We know there's no investigative capacity in the priority crimes litigation unit. We know the Hawks is an absolute disaster. We know that the NPA generally has limited bandwidth and skill and capacity on forensic investigations around finances, for example. And so I'm curious about your comments about what's realistic and perhaps to ask you also, what are the prospects for a civil claim here and civil action? If it's about getting Ellis's money, which I fully approve of, going for that, what are the, and that's where it hurts them. the most is if, even if they have to spend money on courts and all the rest of it, but it's high risk as well in terms of genocide. Sorry for dominating.
It's asked those and then can you do it in reverse order?
Okay.
Yeah, thanks for the question. You know, it's funny, we were talking about that just before the launch, actually. So just on the question of, you know, how realistic is it that this case will ever see the light of day, essentially? Personally, my own views would be that, you know, it's very easy to be pessimistic. And, you know, as you've already alluded to, we see how the NPA has tried to manage it's dealing with the TRC cases, and how it's struggling, even, you know, when they report to Parliament on what is the status of those investigations. There is a very strong theme of not being able to deal with them to their best ability because they are undercapacitated, have resources, there are changes in you know, personnel constantly. So it's not great, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't pursue the matter in any case. And I think, more importantly, if this is a kind of case that can shed a light on what it is that we can do to fill in the gaps within the NPA, to improve its capacity, to improve its skill set. You know, if we find ourselves in court asking, you know, what can we do? Then that is an opportunity to bolster our institutions. That is an opportunity to bolster our accountability mechanisms. And that still makes the matter worth it. If Gillis dies before that happens, I mean, I guess it's a pity. But that doesn't mean that there isn't something beneficial that can come out of that. And then I guess it makes sense as to why you would consider, okay, a civil case. The difference there is that, well, who brings it, right? Then you have a question of locus standi, which is basically your right to bring an issue before court. And the right would be on behalf of the Rwandan people, right? But you would have to do a lot of justification as to why you would do this in your civil capacity. And also, what does that mean for, you know, court cases, I think, can also be very symbolic. And sometimes it's important to see governments acting in a way that very clearly makes a political stand, as opposed to it coming from a, you know, some sort of sector of civil society. I agree that if it hurts the pockets of those who are guilty, then maybe it's worth considering. But I think it's quite dangerous to get into a place where we act on behalf of our government because they don't have the capacity, instead of really holding the mirror up against them and saying, well, we shouldn't have to do this. You should be the ones taking this on. It is your responsibility. As Henny said, it's why we all pay through the nose in taxes. And I think we should have a very cautious approach when it comes to private prosecutions, especially for matters as huge as an international crime of genocide.
On Rwanda, South Africa, and Rwanda's response, I don't know, Simon, were you able to get in touch with the Rwandan government?
I did. I got in touch with the spokesperson of the Rwandan government, the information minister, and she said that the matter of the apartheid regime and its remnants supporting the genocidaires in Rwanda was settled. There's no contestation from their side that that had happened. That apartheid South Africa played a major role, and they weren't particularly interested in following up on the details, although they did ask to see the report when it was released.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. There's also one other aspect of this deal that we haven't discussed yet at length, is an actual Rwandan beyond Tiones Bagasora was also involved in this arms transaction. So in June '94, one day before the arms are supposed to be purchased in the Seychelles, at the FNB at the Carlton Center, a man called Alfred Kalisa, who's a South African Rwandan, is stopped trying to deposit travelers' checks into the bank account of Taris Ellis. He stopped because those travelers' checks were acquired by the Bank of Rwanda, which at the time was obviously under embargo as well because they're obviously trying to buy weapons. So the travelers' checks, which were issued by Thomas Cook, were flagged as, this is illegal, you cannot do this. And for the first time, well, I don't know if it's the first time, but it's one of the rare times that a bank actually stops an illegal transaction from happening. So FNB brings in the South African police and stops Kalisa from depositing this money. So he was one of the middlemen who had helped bring Bagasora and Ellis together. And his work in this deal was to actually help the money transactions go through. But because he is stopped in South Africa, that money is not able to go through. So what is then done, instead then they try to use a bank that is more amiable to the Rwandan government, and that is BNP Paribas. So that money is having to be rerouted through BNP Paribas. But through Alfred, we are able to garner a lot of information about what actually happened in '94. How did these individuals all meet? And Alfred Kalisa provides to Belgian and South African and Rwandan authorities an affidavit in which he chronicles several meetings in Johannesburg between these Rwandan genocidaires and Ellis, how he brought them together and how he was supposed to deposit this money. He gives us the exact amounts. He writes it down in an affidavit that he signs and provides to Belgian authorities. And that affidavit is actually bringing us to the second question, in the records of the ICTR. And that's how we obtained them. We downloaded them from their archival material. But Alfred Kalisa is a very interesting man. He is, in the story, he tells us he's a friend to Ellis, so he knows arms dealers. He's helping them broker arms. He lists himself as a financier. He's still alive to this day. He used to run a bank called BC. And yes, and he's also very close to Paul Kagame to this day, and has been tried and convicted of economic crimes in the DRC, because his bank was very much an affiliate of the state in there. But he's one of those people who is able to have lived many lives. He was first a refugee in Burundi, as a Tutsi refugee. And then he moves to America and studies at the Boston University. Then comes to live in South Africa and is somehow friends with Ellis, brokers this transaction, finds a new life in post-genocide Rwanda, and is working in finance. Then finds a new life in the DRC, comes back again then to Rwanda, is convicted of crime in Rwanda, pardoned officially by Kagame's regime, and then is able to continue being one of the wealthiest men in that country. We sent a letter to Alfred Kalisa. Alfred Kalisa is currently the ambassador to Egypt and Tunisia for Rwanda. He has not responded. I think this is a part of his life that he would very much like to forget, especially as someone who is a Tutsi person. I'm assuming that his role in facilitating this is something of great and deep embarrassment to him, which is something that we saw in the paper that he submitted. But yeah.
And maybe why the Rwandan government isn't interested.
Yes, maybe that's right.
Yeah, and I think such a reminder, Mamelo, I think you kind of quite vividly also pointed out the way in which people morph and play different roles for different people. And I mean, that's the reminder of how slippery institutions, private institutions and individuals often are of finding new allyships and continuing the great game in a way for other people. And what happens when you don't hold them to account at the beginning of the crimes, whatever those are, there's a kind of a repetitive behavior, I think that we see happen. And maybe just to say very clearly, we don't undertake this work because we are seeking allyship with governments or powerful governments like the government of Rwanda. We are sitting today physically in Nelson Mandela Square. We know at the Michelangelo fancy hotel right across the square. the opponents of Kagame's regime and members of the a member of the political elite was assassinated by assassins that were sent by Kagame's government. So these, this is a government that has, I think, many questions to answer, the current government in Rwanda, in terms of the way activists have been treated and opponents, political opponents or dissidents have been treated as well. But ultimately, our interest is to stand with the people who have been impacted by those deals. That's our starting and our end position. And it's really, for the interests of those people not to be caught up in the kind of geopolitical interests of whether, where exactly Rwanda is today in Mozambique. We understand those are important considerations, whether or not they're protecting the interests of French oil companies in Mozambique or not, and how those things are linked. I think we should all be aware of that, but the starting point is justice for the people who've been impacted.
There was a question over there.
Good morning, everyone. Well, thanks for the brilliant input from our colleagues from Open Secret. My name is Kenny Mabasa. I run a small, I don't run it because perhaps I'm the only person who works for it. So there's not other people that are around. But I have a very strong background in what you call international disarmament, demilitarization, and maybe fighting for peace. In my really novice way. So I'm the last director of the NGO called the Ceasefire Campaign. If you remember, there was that NGO. It's known in other, just to make that intro, I think I'll connect the dot quickly. We're gonna vote in 2024. There was a slogan at some point, use the ballot, not the bullet. It's the organization that
To the apartheid regime. So I was just wondering, you guys spoke in detail about the army industry and how it works. For someone who doesn't know, it was really fascinating. I was just wondering, from this work and from this research that came out, not just this work, but the other work that you've also done, obviously you've now been able to gather a lot of information about how the arms industry actually works. And you get to see the loopholes. I was just wondering how one is able to, and I don't know if this is naive, but how one is able to use that information to kind of make recommendations about how the arms industry is regulated. It's responsible for killing so many people. It has to be regulated better. If it's as simple as just getting an end user certificate from somewhere else, and clearly we need to strengthen those measures, much more. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. My name is Claude Mardena Keitari. I'm actually from Rwanda. My two questions were covered by our first colleague, but I got a bit sensitive when you spoke about Alfred Karisa and his involvement in this deal. There are some issues that I may talk with you in private, but on this issue of Alfred Karisa, I would doubt if really he saved Theoneste Bagosora. But what I can tell you, the issue of Rwanda started far in, actually on the 1st of October, 1990. And those Karisa was already here, and late Miko Rwaitare, if you know, there are a number of people. They were saving the RPF, which became now on power from July 1994. I'm saying this because I was part of that. Alfred Karisa had some problems with the regime today, the Paul Kagame regime, only because as a businessman and the other businessmen that time, from 1990, helped the rebels when they were still in the struggle. So he wanted actually his cut, which they didn't want to give him. He lost everything. He lost his businesses here. The BCDI bank you are talking about was in Rwanda, and it was moved to Congo actually when we attacked Congo in 1996.
Yes.
So when I'm looking at the middlemen or the chief of middlemen that you spoke about, I think he was, yes, connected to Alfred Karisa, but Alfred Karisa was working for another boss who is not Colonel Bagosora. This issue came up again because I happened to be a protected witness in Arusha. I was not for Bagosora, but for his colleague, Gratier Kabirigi, General Gratier Kabirigi, from Military 1. I did Military 1 and Military 2. Bagosora had nothing, absolutely nothing to do with Alfred Karisa, but this is something that they put it on his head. Because remember, he's the one who said, no, we are going to start apocalypse. And they said, oh, apocalypse mean genocide. But far, I'm a Tutsi for your own information, but far, the genocide against Tutsi started in 1994. But there was another one which took place from October 1990, who was supplying those. And the war was very hot, and it was against Hutu. I think let me stop here. Only that what I can tell you, Alfred Karisa and the other businessmen, I will talk about Ruzugi Tribet. I will talk, if you know, yes, cigarette was manufactured in East London and the owner was from Rwanda, a lot of things. But the only thing I want to add, please do a thorough research and get witnesses or testimonies from both sides. When I say both sides, they are pro current government today, and they are people who are nowhere actually related to this government. I thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to just invite the three panelists to respond to the comments, but also to make these your closing remarks. So let's start with Henny.
Sure.
It's okay. We'll have to deal with that afterwards.
All right. Well, thanks very much, and it's great to be able to engage. Deal with maybe just two things briefly, if I can. There was the one comment that was made about the arms industry, and Open Secrets is in fact has been working together with the fact that we continue to support the South African government. We have ones who are supposed to make a decision about where companies in South Africa that produce weapons, and there's still a number of others and others directly in any event, is the supply of weapons that are produced in Potchefstroom and in the West, and that are shipped to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates by a German arms company, Rwandan, that works together with Denel through a local subsidiary. They aren't allowed those weapons from Germany, so they use South African know-how to manufacture those weapons, and then they ship them off. And those weapons, we are able to show, have been used against civilians in Yemen to murder people, to murder innocent people. We have not fully learned from our experience of the past, to be very clear. This isn't as if this is all just a forgotten history. This goes on because there's money to be made to act in compliance with South African law and the South African Constitution, which is precisely what we need to be doing. So we're not all experts on end-user certificates, and I'll be very clear, our colleagues here and all of our colleagues in the Open Secrets team certainly are not. We learn about these things because we do need to understand how it works, but I think we should all be able to understand at least the impact of what this violence has. Very quick point, if I can. just go back to this question that I've just been reflecting on the one or two questions I asked about. Do we have the capacity to deal with accountability? I think it's been asked twice in a way. And I just want to stress is that the change in the National Prosecuting Authority happened almost 5 years ago when there was a new leadership under Shamila Batoy and her colleagues. The new dawn has been with us for some years. There comes a point when it's not up to us as the people to make excuses for the people that are in powerful positions as to why they can't do it. They've got to make a decision to act. From our liberation, we have not inherited a half a constitution. It's a full document. You don't get to cherry pick the things that you like, and you don't get to cherry pick the cases that you like and then come with nonsense to tell us that, we just woke up on the wrong side of the bed, we couldn't find the right people. It's your job to find the right people. It's your job to act in the interests of the public and to hold the powerful to account. And so, I think our argument very clearly is, don't come to us with this nonsense. If that is what happens, don't tell us that you can't, with one mouth, you tell us that you can't deal with the TRC cases because, but on the other hand, the same government comes to us and says, we celebrate the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and what it achieved. The TRC said to us, the commissioner said, we didn't finish the work's got to go on. It's up to you, arms of government, to ensure accountability. Well, we're saying, get on with it.
I think your name is Claude. Be with you, and that's why if you look at how we've written the report, we start at 1990 because the Civil War began, and we say very specifically that this is a story about the Rwandan Civil War and the Rwandan Genocide and what is allowed to happen. And a lot of the arms that actually were supplied to the FAR and to the RPF were initially intended for the Civil War. The intention was not always the genocide. What broke that, I guess, was the breaking of the Arusha Peace Agreement by the downing of the president of Rwanda's at the time's plane, Habyarimana. When that plane went down, that's when I guess Bagasora says we're going to start the apocalypse and we will do whatever. And he's allegedly the one who brought down that plane. There are many things that we can debate. But I think what you said about Kalisa and also about the stories that are told about the Rwandan genocide, about the Rwandan Civil War, they show what Henny's just saying, There needs to be an accountability for the people who sell these kinds of weapons and who know where they're going. Because in 1992, when Arms Corps made the transaction with the Rwandan government, they were just making it for a government that's fighting rebels. But those weapons end up on Iwawa Island in 1994, where people are massacred in the Rwandan genocide. Because you can keep weapons for 2 years and use them in many other terrible situations. And I think perpetuated by the arms industry and why we need to really hold them accountable. And if we are going to live in a world of peace, we need these individuals, we need our governments to actively be working for peace, because this is something that, this could have been avoided had many governments just listened to the rhetoric of what government was saying, to the rhetoric of the people supplying the arms. They could have just been very cautious and seen that this would lead to a genocide. And just like he mentioned in our work on Yemen, if you listen to the rhetoric of the Saudi Arabian government and the UAE and how they speak about Yemeni people, Yemeni civilians who've been murdered, you can hear the intent is not, we're going to fix the Yemeni state. It is destruction. And if you, as the NCACC, sit at those meetings and think we can sell arms to these people and it's fine, because their stated intent is not genocide or ethnic cleansing, I think you really need to think a little bit more critically. Your job is to think, and you need to really use the thinking brain stop selling weapons. I would actually just like to abolish the arms industry, but we can first start with regulation.
It's good to
I had a question.
Yeah.
I had a question. I need to know, South Africa on the Armstead was not involved in it. South Africa, I need to know, because there are so many people who are gone, who are dead. Because there are some other people, they are making soldiers around to our place. They paint their face with a shoe polish or floor polish, a black polish. And those people, when you check on their hand, the weapon that they have is not a South African weapon. They were using other weapons. That's why I'm asking a question like this, to say, South Africa was not involved in an arms deal, because there's other places where we're next door on it, we're sitting there, we're watching people, looking people, because it was so tense at that time. It was not so good. But when we see these people, because we are the patron of the people at that time. Now, what makes me to ask a question like that? Because the weapon that they have in their hand, like only South African soldiers. South Africa kills people like slow. My question, South Africa was involved, as we need to understand about it. South Africa was involved in that Mediterranean ship that was staying at the Asia. South Africa, the other weapons were not there that they would send to South Africa. It's what I want to understand. Because we had so many problems on the government. Because government, they refused to do what people need. And now, it's whereby I need to understand. South Africa was involved there and get people to come and kill on the regime time, not now, on the regime time.
Thanks for that question.
Yeah. Can we just very briefly say, you're referring to during the last years of apartheid when you said
Yes.
the third force, when you said people had their faces painted, and as you said, they had other kind of weapons. I'm not sure if I can answer all of your questions, but I think something that we do think about a lot is where those weapons came from that were used by the third force and many others at the time. And we shouldn't forget, there are others in the room who have a better understanding of many of those things, but what we do understand as well is that very often to camouflage that they were not part of the military, they would use AK-47s and other things. And what we know, for example, is that the Chinese government during apartheid was doing a roaring business selling AK-47s to Pretoria. But nobody wants to talk about that. And I'm using that just as an example. Today, China, we talk about China as an allyship with Africa. It's complicated. And I think it's a reminder to ourselves how dirty this business of war is, how much trouble it gets us into, and how hard it is to hold the people who are behind these deals to account. So I think what you point to is very important for us just to remember, because what you point to is this complexity, that we talk. I mean, I think we need to reflect on that and the complexity of the actors who are involved and how difficult it is to hold them to account.
The last word.
Yeah, I think maybe just in closing, it's that, there are so many mirrors between the way in which governments can be complicit in violence in Rwanda and South Africa. There's so many similarities to draw from, and I think that's why pursuing whatever forms of accountability we can are so important, so that we can at least, we can't ask anyone else to do our dirty work. We have to get our hands dirty and not allow for complacency to be the thing, as the gentleman said, that kills us. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much to the Open Secrets team for the really, really wonderful work in this report. A big round of applause. I believe that there are refreshments being served just outside and turn to the left. And also, if you are leaving straight away, out the door to the left, please, at the request of the library. Thank you all very much for joining us today, and we can continue these conversations over drinks.
Thank you.
Okay.